Hi, I hope you're doing well. Today I'd like to talk with you about Heterosexual Deviance, Chapter 11 from Clenard and Meyer's book. A lot of good information in this one, so let's get started. The introduction talks a little bit about husbands and wives in more traditional housework arrangements, and some studies indicate that there's greater sexual frequency with those couples than with couples that split housework arrangements 50-50. So someone studied this. This is something that has been researched. And then there's also a discussion about someone who has a phone conversation, phone sex, thinking that it's a conversation with a woman, but instead the man, is having a conversation with a man. And there are a lot of ways you can think about deviance. And in this instance, deviance perhaps from a pattern, the pattern of how you arrange the housework in a house versus the patterns of who you expect to have sex with and norms related to revealing and concealing and honesty. So we start then by talking about sexual behavior as governed by norms that regulate socially acceptable practices and general orientations. People become sexual beings by acquiring sexual scripts. These depict sex roles that are learned in a process called sexual socialization. In your text states sexual behavior is a normative behavior. Traditional religious beliefs have powerfully influenced these norms. It's hard to understate that. Changes, though, have been occurring. Premarital sex, for example, no longer draws as much moral disapproval as it did in earlier decades. And people learn these norms through interactions with others. You don't come into this world knowing what those norms are. Sexual behavior also, you learn, encompasses a wide variety of acts, and that can include different types of participants, situations, statuses, and the physical surroundings. If we're talking about deviating from sexual norms, these norms encompass many different types of behavior. Some of them are prohibited by law, and some of them are likely to draw other kinds of negative reactions. For example, someone might get stared at in public if they're dressing as someone from the opposite sex might. So there's a range, as we've talked about with all of these forms of deviance, of acceptance and sanctions connected to those forms. Sexual deviance, it says, is an act contrary to the sexual norms of the group in which it occurs. And like we've talked about, the norms are emergent and contextual, and sometimes they're understood quite differently by those involved. Judgments of sexual deviation consider certain important characteristics, and these are also listed in your text. The degree of consent, such as norms that prohibit forcible rape. Now this comes into discussion when we consider date rape and the idea of what counts as consent, the role of alcohol in giving consent, and pro-social movements these days which say that yes means yes, you have to have affirmative consent in some places. The second point, the identities of the participants are also part of the judgment of sexual deviation, such as norms that restrict legitimate sexual partners to human beings and exclude animals. Relationships between participants, norms that restrict legitimate sex to certain ages and kinship groups, and certain kinds of acts, as well as the settings in which the sex acts occur. Here are some that are listed in your text. Forced sexual relations would be forcible rape. sexual intercourse with a person under a certain age is statutory rape. Molestation of a child, adultery, far less prohibited now than it was in the past, but in the past very prohibited. Sexual relations in a group setting, swinging, abortion, exhibitionism, voyeurism, bestiality, and pornography are all topics that are seen as volatile and need to be considered very carefully, if not outright prohibited. What has happened is we've had a revolution, you could say, in sexual behavior. And this was occurring in the 60s. The idea of free love and openness of people to sexual experience. So this revolution led to an increased permissiveness concerning a number of different sexual acts. Examples: premarital sexual intercourse. Again, adultery in the past was very much frowned upon, and in this instance, premarital sexual intercourse was something that was seen as all right by the free love generation. Spouse swapping was part of what some people considered an alternative lifestyle, as long as both parties consented. Open marriages, marriages where two people together might have sexual relations with people outside of that marriage. Here's some stuff from your text. Some groups have enthusiastically welcomed such openness. Others bitterly condemn the trends. There's a study by Smith, who reported a drop in the percentage of respondents who agreed that premarital sex is always wrong. And over roughly a 20-year period, it dropped from 35% disagreement to 25% disagreement. Also, the belief that such practices are not wrong at all rose from 26% to 42%. So this is rooted in the work of a researcher in 1990. Let's try a review question. What is the term for a common practice that includes a woman's preference to routinely wear pants and men to wear earrings? According to your text, these are not normative behaviors for men or women, and the term for this is gender bending. The answer B. There are also selected forms of heterosexual deviance discussed in your text. It can include acts like premarital and extramarital sex, as well as prostitution, and there's a good bit of information in your text on these. The meaning of sexual deviance varies in different situations and, of course, is dependent on society's norms. There's a great deal of information on the history of extramarital sex. It talks about how Emperor Augustus in 18 BC had some social problems occurring in Rome. He wanted to elevate the morals and the numbers of upper classes in Rome and to increase the population of native Italians. So he created laws to encourage marriage and having children, including provisions against adultery, seeing adultery as a crime. And this is the idea here. Extramarital sex refers to sexual behavior by a married person with someone who's not his or her spouse. And there are many different reasons for engaging in extramarital affairs that vary by gender. Here's some examples of those. Women feel affairs offer reassurance of their desirability, better sex, a change in routine, sexual variety, and sex without commitment. Also, too, emotional satisfaction. Men, on the other hand, had affairs for sexual variety, reassurance of their desirability, a change in routine, better sex, and sex without commitment. So some slight differences between the two. Today, there's a lot of discussion about sex and computers. Several people use the internet to promote prostitution and sexual services as a means to make money. Now, some of this has been curtailed recently. There have been some changes in law to diminish the use of, say, for example, Craigslist for solicitation. So your textbook is a little bit out of date on this, but still the issue is important. Phone sex, a more recent variation of techniques used to provide remote sexual stimulation, either within or outside of marriage. And phone sex has been diminishing in use since the growth of the internet and the ease of accessibility of pornographic images and cams and use of those for people to interact. Which leads into cybersex, using computers to flirt, exchange romantic messages, and sexual satisfaction online. Participants in cybersex usually meet in chat rooms on the internet. This may or may not be as true as it once was. Again, the webcam and the one-on-one interpersonal exchanges seem to be more prevalent today. There have been some investigations, though, about crimes that were committed and sting operations by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So one of them, it says Operation Candyman in 2002, was focused on the Candyman E-Group, which was interested in child pornography. And it might surprise you, but among those arrested were Roman Catholic priests, Protestant clergy, Little League coaches, a school bus driver, and a daycare center worker. The other one mentioned here, Operation Flea Collar, was focused on a large website that provided escort services. Florida prosecutors charged not only the sex workers who advertised on the site, but also the website owners and the registered users of the site. Sex work and prostitution. Sex work highlights the commercialized nature of some forms of sex. In other words, the instrumental, transactional nature of it. Instrumental means a means to an end, trying to accomplish something, and not emotionally expressive. Things like exotic dancing, erotic massage, escort services, telephone sex operations, prostitution, and any other type of work that deals with impersonal sexual activity, which again involves monetary, some type of exchange in that context. It should be noted that prostitution seems to be a cultural universal, but also is disapproved widely. The idea, again, involves exchanges of sex for money. Most prostitution arrests target people in their early 20s, and about 60% of those apprehended were white. It's also reported that only 20% of adult men have had some experience with prostitutes. Before we continue, there's a few pages of information in your text that's worth discussing. Prostitution says it's generally a crime, but in the US and most other countries, laws prohibit not the sex acts themselves, and that's important, but solicitation to perform the acts in exchange for money. So it's an important legal distinction. It says the general culture in the US stimulates images of the importance of sexual values in life, and many men have trouble satisfying these resulting values or desires. So this is a conflict between cultural messages and the ability to achieve what is being promoted. Prostitution can frequently also, too, though, involve brutality along with the sex itself, and that prostitutes become rape victims at higher rates than non-prostitutes. Some people have myths. They believe that forced sex with a prostitute does not constitute rape, which is false, that such an act would cause no harm to the prostitute, and that prostitutes in some sense deserve to be raped, all of which are pernicious myths. There's a discussion about how people consider different aspects when they're trying to find a prostitute. Some people are looking for personal warmth and friendliness. Although they wanted to pay for sex, it seems they did not want to deal with somebody whose demeanor constantly reminded them that they were paying for it. It says here that one study in Southern California, 72 prostitutes, this was in 1990, they averaged 8 clients a day, fees from $20 to $100, the most common being $30. And in 1971, a study of 2,000 prostitutes were used to estimate the amount of money generated by prostitution in the United States. It seems that there's collectively $1 billion each year, and that was from 1971. So a lot of money being exchanged in this. Also, though, it's hard to get good information on prostitution from arrest records because arrests can also involve charges other than solicitation. Some may be charged with vagrancy, loitering, and there can also be patterns or sweeps which seem to indicate that you're not getting information steadily across time, representative information. There's a percent of prostitutes, it says here, Kinsey and his associates estimated this accounted for less than 10% of all total non-marital sexual activities, and it's undoubtedly lower today. So some of this actually relates more to the percent of prostitutes being solicited. Much of the decrease in the patronage seems to have resulted from increases in sexual freedom for women. So some other important information beyond the slide. A question. Prostitution only occurs in the United States? Should be pretty easy. The answer is no. It occurs all over the world, it seems. And there are several international dimensions discussed in your text. First, the illicit trafficking of girls and women sold to private parties as sexual slaves, or to others who run prostitution services. And this is also pernicious, a very awful thing. Illicit trafficking of girls and women from country to country produces less criminal activity than trade in illicit commodities, such as drugs, but it pervades many regions. Women are coerced, persuaded with offers of money, or kidnapped. Traffickers resell the women, as mentioned in the slide, often cannot escape. And government inattention has seemingly allowed the problem to continue. There are a few statistics there and numbers. India and Southeast Asia, many may see prostitution as an opportunity to make money for their families. So parents putting their kids in the hands of pimps so that they may earn money from their child, a form of sexual slavery. And those numbers you can see in Asia versus in the United States. There's discussions about the types of prostitution and also where it occurs. In Germany, legalized prostitution started in 2002, and it's seen as just another job. There's a club called Artemis, a 9,000 square foot place with over 4 floors that opened in time for the, let's see, what was the event? The World Cup by 2006. Apparently made a lot of money at that point. It also mentions too, sex work reflects voluntary and involuntary dimensions. This isn't something that is completely voluntary, you could argue, but also it has some other aspects. It says prostitution, when it's called sex work, emphasizes that it's really more like a job. And there's been a great deal of discussion about the legalization of prostitution. The Artemis Club is detailed in your text. It says that the admission charge is about 70 euros or $122 just to get into the club. And then the basic charge for services, about $105 for a half an hour. which leads into the types of prostitutes. The streetwalker, the most common type, solicits directly for clients in a relatively public place like a street corner or a bus. The bar girl solicits in public places but offers more protection from public view than a street corner. It says sometimes these prostitutes solicit clients alone, others work with pimps, and this person, it says, depends on physical attraction because of limited opportunities in these bars. Then it talks about what is the highest status of prostitution called. These are women who typically work out of an apartment or hotel room and take clients through referrals from trusted sources. Obviously, we've gone through the bar girl, the streetwalker. That only leaves a couple choices. And it would be the call girl. The highest status. Typically, this person's working out of an apartment or hotel room, and again, takes clients through referrals from trusted sources. There are other forms of prostitution, and certain prostitutes work through massage parlors, photography studios, commercial escort agencies. And actually there were many of these in Las Vegas when I was there for graduate school, because the idea of an escort agency was not necessarily prostitution. So they could legally advertise for these things, even though everybody involved knew that this really was about prostitution. The phrase used in your text, road whores, prostitutes who travel with a specific group of clients, such as working class migrant labor camps. Traveling prostitution. Another question. Which of the following is not a prostitute who works in business offices? The answer? D. Convention girls, not one of the types listed in your text. Kinds of prostitution. From the previous slide, you'll see 3 kinds that work in business offices, discussed in your textbook. Party girls have sex with clients for money. Mistresses form sexual relationships with bosses. That's for desire to ensure job security. Career climbers are extending that idea to sexual relationships with a series of bosses to advance in the organization. Prostitution and deviant street networks. There are several paragraphs devoted to this in your text. Deviant street networks provide the settings for much prostitution. So what does that mean? Networks of people who are engaged in a number of different illicit activities. It says hustles, prostitution's among them. So this can include petty theft, forgery, credit card fraud, embezzlement, drug trafficking, robbery, burglary. And it says in your text, most of these operated under the control of black males, typically who had already have extensive police records. The networks recruit women as prostitutes from a number of places. And those women largely come from family structures and backgrounds that resemble the deviant street network. So part of the discussion, the deviant street networks recruit girls from the city population of runaways to become prostitutes, and they offer shelter and money in exchange for their labor. There's a myth that's very silly, and I guess we can talk that through for a minute, the happy hooker myth. Also, the idea of the pretty woman stereotype or theme, I guess you would say, from that film, that these women, prostitutes, are sexy and that prostitution is sexy. It's a pretty woman who freely enters into prostitution basically as a way of earning money until she decides to voluntarily quit and finds the right man. Prostitutes, it says, clearly pursue economic motivations and engage in the activity mostly for money. But it says the myth does not at all approach the reality. A couple things that they mention statistically. Most prostitutes are between 17 and 24 years old. There's some older women who continue, sometimes for money and sometimes as a lucrative endeavor, but often raising funds for drug addiction, alcoholism, or expensive habits. Most share a desire to improve their economic position. It's primarily about money. Some studies say that some of the characteristics of prostitutes: early sexual activity, a history of delinquency in school, and prior commitments to training schools for girls. Some said the mean age of first intercourse, some studies said about 13 years of age, and a number of previous past family difficulties, including things like divorce. Child prostitutes has its own section in the text, and the phrase baby pros is there from 1979. This may be dated now, it's 40 years old. There are child prostitutes who were studied between the ages of 8 and 12, that these girls often receive their introductions to this activity through their parents or other family members. All were attending elementary school. None were runaways. However, there are also those who do run away from home to escape physical abuse and neglect. Asia is considered the world's largest sex market for child prostitutes. Very ineffective or limited state regulation in those countries. As mentioned, the idea of child prostitutes, you can differ from adolescent prostitutes, a little bit of an older age category, and those careers generally begin around age 14. Typically, those prostitutes are coming from dysfunctional homes and trouble at school, at home, and in the community. It says in your text too, street kids engage in prostitution at extremely high rates, so runaways. A study in Miami reported that 5% of the boys and 87% of the girls engaged in prostitution at least some of the time. Usually serving 30 to 50-year-old men from a variety of social and occupational backgrounds. Discussing prostitution as a career, it involves an association with people who live on the fringes of prostitution as an important contributor to participation in this activity. So part of a network of people who live on the fringes of prostitution. And a discussion in your text of the career call girl with 3 developmental stages, sequential stages of process. The first, entrance into the career. The second, apprenticeship. And then the third, development of contacts. A study of 33 Los Angeles call girls, half had begun moving toward the career through contact with a call girl. After making contact, you have apprenticeship, an average of 2 to 3 months of working in other people's apartments and training. They learn the value structure of the profession and guidelines for handling problem situations, very important for personal safety. The training also transmits the belief that prostitution simply represents a more honest sexual behavior than that of most people. Drug-motivated competition has decreased prices for prostitution services because addicts are wanting their fix and they just need the money to get that. So it undercuts other prostitutes in terms of price. They want to make an income sufficient to support their habit. And there's some complaints that you could see here too in your text. One woman said, those rock stars, females who habitually smoke crack, with them you can't make money anymore. So again, that notion of undercutting others. Prostitutes who exchange sex for drugs often think of themselves as freer than those who work for pimps. You can think too in terms of the self-concept of sex workers, prostitutes. Societal reactions, arrests, and associations with other prostitutes promote change in the prostitute's self-concept. There's a hierarchy among types of prostitutes, as we've already discussed. For example, call girls may look down upon prostitutes and associate that work strictly with streetwalkers. A question from your reading. Most prostitutes who contract AIDS do so by using drugs, and many believe that they can avoid AIDS through regular use of a condom. Is that true or false? It actually is true. As it says on this slide, most prostitutes who contract AIDS, it's usually through intravenous drug use rather than the sexual contact they have with customers. And many believe that they can avoid that through the regular use of condoms. The greater danger, or I should say the greatest danger of AIDS for prostitutes, can also, though, involve sexual relations with high-risk, non-paying partners with whom they have formed romantic attachments. And that weakens their resolve to use condoms. So these are individuals who have a longer-term relationship with this person, and they want to engage in sex without a condom as a form of intimacy. There are quite varied attitudes toward prostitution in different countries. As mentioned earlier, it's legal in Germany. It's legal in some other parts of Europe. It's legal in the state of Nevada, in the counties outside of Reno and Las Vegas, a number of counties, not all of them, but they have brothels. They're controlled, regulated by the state, and they're taxed. There's also some discussion about the past, history. In ancient Greece, prostitutes commanded generally high respect. In India, in the past, dancing girls plied their trade in connection with that country's temples for centuries. Throughout the Middle Ages, European societies did not regard prostitution as a criminal activity, but rather a necessary evil. Anglo-American criminal law has strong disapproval from prostitution, particularly soliciting, as discussed earlier. And it says such strident attitudes derived largely from the Protestant Reformation. Many Catholic countries display comparatively tolerant views of this act. And the police, it says in that other point, they generally focus on apprehending prostitutes instead of punishing customers. Now this depends, because there's an argument to be made for punishing those who are supplying the product and punishing those who are trying to engage in the interaction. So sometimes there's a sting on Johns, and sometimes there's a focus on prostitutes. It depends. The ideas in your text mention that laws against prostitution generally discriminate against women. Again, women are often targeted as opposed to their customers, the men. There's a group with an acronym COYOTE, Call Off Your Tired Ethics, that's been around since 1973. And the organization attempted to change public attitudes toward prostitution by calling for the decriminalization of the practice. There are a lot of criticisms, though, of prostitution. One, it involves promiscuity with strangers. Two, prostitute damages other social relationships by commercializing sex. Women who engage in prostitution experience unwholesome social effects. It presents a threat to public health. Prostitutes need protection in order to operate, so their arrangements with police officers reduce the general quality of law enforcement. If law enforcement is engaged in this activity, it's taking it away from Other, potentially you could say more serious crimes. Nevertheless, Coyote and some other organizations that they discuss have some central ideas to try to make prostitution decriminalized. First of all, it says not all prostitution is forced. Some of it involves free will and choice. Prostitution represents merely a service occupation in the community, and we in the United States have a very large service sector. So there's a big question, well, could this be considered a service? Denying women the choice to engage in prostitution violates a woman's civil rights to work as she pleases. And again, it is interesting to think, well, who's criminalizing this and why? What are the reasons behind criminalization? Another group discussed in your text, Whisper, Women Hurt in Systems of Prostitution Engaged in Revolt, another acronym. This is a group, conversely, that depicts the downside of prostitution. It includes graphic accounts of women restrained by their customers in chains and ropes, burned with cigarettes by pimps, and generally degraded sexually for money that they need in order to live. Pornography warrants a few pages in your text. A couple of key Supreme Court decisions, one of which is Miller versus California in 1973, and I'd like you to know this one. The Supreme Court ruled that states can classify material as obscene and ban it, and these are the specific words to note, if an average person applying contemporary standards would find it, 1, appeals to prurient interests in sex, 2, describes sexual conduct in a, quote, patently offensive way, and 3, taken as a whole, lacks serious literacy, artistic, political, or scientific value. So these are a lot of terms that can be debated, and so that's why sometimes trying to define what counts as pornography has been very, very difficult and very contentious. Critics of pornography deplore its perceived effect of promoting female submission and male domination. That's material from your textbook. The word derives from the Greek word, which is porn, which actually originally referred to prostitutes and their trade. The social and political concern over the potential for harmful effects of obscenity, and that's a legal term, and pornography, which is a popular term, has built over time. In the past, pornography was seen as part of life in, say, for example, Greece. In the Middle Ages, there were pornographic representations that were readily available. In the United States, we have this contemporary legal concern, which has resulted in these commissions that were established to look at the problems associated with pornography and its use. The first one, Commission on Obscenity and Pornography, was from 1970. And that commission concluded that exposure to pornography does not promote sexually aggressive behavior. In the 1986 commission, the suggestion reversed. It said it may lead directly to variations of this sort of behavior. A man making a sexual advance to a woman, suffering rejection and raping the woman was something that they found as a theme in a fair amount of pornography. And most of the materials, including those in magazines and motion picture formats, depict female characters as eventually becoming aroused and ecstatic about the sexual activity. The content of pornographic films, the 86 Commission found, confirms stereotypes of male superiority and female passivity, and that male desires and satisfaction eclipse the importance of female needs. Regarding the social regulation of pornography, New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, a group, pressed for legislation tightening restrictions against pornography. And U.S. legal opinion on regulation of pornography includes two things. Paris Adult Theaters versus Sultan. This is, again, a Supreme Court decision. And Miller versus California, like we have already discussed. Pornography, there's no shortage of it available today, and in many formats. Mass media outlets like the web, films, novels, television shows, periodicals, and newspapers all graphically portray sexual images and behaviors. And again, that is also dependent on how you define what counts as pornography. Actors and actresses are drawn into this work for a variety of reasons. Money, freedom, flexible hours, and fun. Again, some problems with pornography. It has been argued it promotes attitudes that perpetuate the rape myth, that in pornographic descriptions, women are sometimes seen as saying no, but they really mean yes, and therefore men can feel justified in acting upon the woman's refusal as an indication of willingness. Again, this is a myth, a pernicious myth. There are also, though, potentially beneficial or positive functions of pornography. Pornography has been found to arouse both sexes, and it may encourage healthy behavior and prevent crime. This is a very important debate that people have as to whether or not pornography might inhibit some men from committing rape, and it's difficult to study and to find good information on this. Sex criminals come disproportionately frequently from sexually restrictive families. This is something your text notes, that if there were more pornography or images of sex available to those people, their participation in crime have been diminished, and they often receive less information and exposure, as I said, to sexual subjects that other people might get. So it says rapists seem to have come unusually frequently from sexually repressive environments. I want to also mention before I close that the term sex worker has often been used to replace prostitute today. Your text mentions the word prostitute primarily, and that's something that reflects the author's choices, but there's a great deal of debate as to how to name people engaged in this type of activity today. Sex work, you could argue, is a much more positive spin, and it changes the idea of what this is concerned with, what it's about. And so I'd like you to think a little too about the importance of naming things or activities in relation to what counts as deviance. Thank you.